Too good. Okay, I think if everybody's almost ready, got your headsets, etc., we will go ahead and start. We're going to do this in English, but we want to be very inclusive in Italian as well. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask them in Italian or English. But before we start, there are the cards being handed out. I don't know if if you all have them, but we'd like you to take a vote on our theme of today, which is, in English, are the links between climate change, migration, and food insecurity being reported by your media? And in Italian, la vostra testata giornalistica collega I cambiamenti climatici con l'immigrazione e l'insicurezza alimentari. By a raise of hands, how many people say yes? 2. And no? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, at least 10. 11. Okay, so much more on no. So that's basically the theme of our discussion today. Let me introduce first our panelists. The first one is Sam Dubberley here on the end. He's a freelance media researcher who's based in Istanbul. For years, he was head of news at the European Broadcast Union and is now the co-founder of Eyewitness Media Hub. He will begin by explaining a very interesting report that he has done called The Untold Story, Climate Change Sinks Below the Headlines. Then to comment on his study, we have Laurie Goering here, and she's from Thomson Reuters Foundation's daily news website on the humanitarian and development impacts of climate change. And something that she does that I find fascinating is that she currently is training over 100 journalists to report on climate change in the developing world. So, and before that, she was for years a correspondent with the Chicago Tribune and has worked all over the globe doing that. We also have here with us today Jacopo Monzini from IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, who has worked on climate change, climate disasters, climate issues in every possible corner of the globe, from the Maldives to Yemen to Moldova, Morocco, you name it, he's been there, Haiti also recently. So without further delay, let me hand over the microphone to Sam Dubberley for his presentation.
Thank you very much. And thank you to IFAD, first of all, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, not only for supporting this project, but also just being there to make it happen. So thank you very much to all of you. And I think we found some interesting points around climate change, around migration, around agriculture, and how our media today report on these issues. Are the slides up there? Yeah, they are. Sorry. So when we began this project, we asked ourselves a question about how do media report on climate change and surrounding issues? And is there a link made between climate change, migration in general, agriculture in general, and what we're seeing today in Europe? And is the media helping our audiences understand exactly what's going on? Now, a lot of you may say in this room as I go through this report, yes, but there's a lot of reporting about climate change in our media. There's an important point why we call this sinking below the headlines. We wanted to look at how a general media observer, not a specialist, not somebody who's deeply, deeply impassioned by or concerned about climate change, looks for stories about climate change. They're easy to find. The work done by Thomson Reuters Foundation, for instance, AlertNet, Internews, organizations such as that, DevNet. There's lots of stories there. They are there. But they're aimed at a specific group of people. We were looking more at general media, so we looked at the headline news, what's on the front pages of our newspapers, not on the page 23 environment section. What's in our main news bulletins, not in the late night talk shows that go deep into issues. We want to look at a general theme throughout this. The methodology we employed for this research, it's been done in three distinct phases, really. First of all, we conducted focus groups. Between July and September of 2015, we conducted 8 focus groups in France and the United Kingdom. We spoke to people who are interested in news, who consume news, in a variety of ways. It didn't really matter what their preference was for news output, newspapers, radio, television, online, whatever. Just they had to be news consumers. The age ranges were very general, ranging from early 20s to 70s. We got a broad spectrum of ages. We also had a broad spectrum of professions. So it was really focused at students, professionals, people who weren't in employment, and so on and so forth. So we had 4 focus groups in France and 4 focus groups in the United Kingdom, held in different cities in both countries. We then conducted content analysis. We had the first set of content analysis in the first 2 weeks of September 2015. Again, France and the United Kingdom. Why France and the United Kingdom? Obviously, you can hopefully tell from my accent, I'm British. I feel that the UK, as European countries, is pretty ahead generally in reporting in these areas, and it made a lot of sense to look at the UK media. Why France? Because we were aiming to present the report at the COP21 summit, which was held in Paris in December of last year. We did content analysis of the main bulletins of the BBC, so the 10 o'clock news of the BBC, and the main news bulletin of Channel 4 News, which is at 7 p.m. on weekdays. In France, we looked at the main bulletins, the 20 heures of TF1 and France 2, and the front pages of the newspapers, The Guardian, Daily Mail, Le Monde, and Libération. So we looked at those over a 2-week period, every day for 2 weeks, to look exactly at what they were reporting on climate change, migration, and farming on the front pages. Obviously, it was during, just by chance, what we could probably say was the peak reporting of the migration crisis in Europe. It was during when the picture of Alan Kurdi, the young Syrian boy, was released. So obviously migration was heavily on the front pages, as we'll see when I get to the results. The content analysis was done basically 2 months before COP21. So on the lead up to the conference here in Perugia, 2 months after, or just slightly after 2 months, 2.5 months after COP21, we carried out the content analysis again. And this time, we kept the same media outlets in the UK and France, but added into it 2 television journals in Italy, so Rai and La Sette, and 2 television bulletins in the United States, CBS and NBC. And then the newspapers, New York Times, USA Today, and La Repubblica and Corriere della Sera. So what did we find, surprisingly, on the front pages of our newspapers and the main bulletins? What we saw in the focus groups, first of all, just talk to you a little bit about the focus groups and how we conducted those. We conducted something called the news game. Now, the news game is quite an interesting methodological tool. What you do is, as you start the focus group, you ask people to actually put together a news bulletin. So they had to sit down around a table with a load of pictures and pretend they were a television news editor. It's really quite fun to watch, actually, how people basically compete over stories as they would in a newsroom. Having worked in newsrooms for years, it felt vaguely familiar, very similar to what I'd seen in the office. People replicated what I'd seen actually in the profession. They then had to report back to me about what they'd found. Now, they think, in the process here, they think they're actually just presenting something back to you, but actually the discussions they have over what the stories they select in the news game actually shows a lot about their thoughts and their views on television news, on news in general. We then had a series of questions that I gave to them, and a general discussion lasting about 1 hour to get their views on how television news reports climate change, how they think television news is failing, or news in general is failing to deliver them what they would like to see as an audience, and also questions about how they think that could be improved, what they would actually like to see in their news output to help them understand the world better and understand the issues we were talking about, climate change, migration, and agriculture better. In terms of the content analysis, we looked at the type of story. So was it a migration story? Was it a climate change story? Was it an agricultural story? And then what kind of related mentions were there? So if it was a story about migration, was there ever a mention of climate change, as to understand why people migrate? If it was a story about climate change, was there a mention of agriculture to understand, people leaving rural environment, moving to cities, and then having to flee conflict or other similar issues? We looked at what kind of voices are heard in the news stories, right? Talking about migration in particular. Were the power voices, the voices in the reporting, either in print or in television, did we actually hear the voices of the migrants, or was it only NGO officials, politicians, EU commissioners, UN officials, those kind of people? And then what kind of geographical reach was the story? If it was an agricultural story, was it an international story? If it was a climate change story, did it focus on the domestic impact of climate change, or was it the international impact of climate change? So all these kind of the issues we're trying to understand through this research, and we report on in the report. So the big headline, as you can see from our report, is climate change stories were either completely absent in the media we looked at, or they actually decreased from between COP21, COP21, where we're told climate change is the biggest challenge facing our generation, to today, to the time we did the coding, we actually had a decrease in the amount of stories about climate change. So it seems that there was a peak around COP21 of everyone's like, front page news, we have to talk about climate change. COP21 happened, we had an agreement, and it swiftly got forgotten about by our media. And how did that see itself? As you can see there, the green stories, the green columns there are stories about migration. As I say, on the left as you're looking at the screen there, we have the UK and French media in the first part of the coding, of the content analysis. So the stories in green are the stories about migration. We had a few stories leading up to COP21 about climate change, and a few stories about agriculture. Nothing at all about smallholder farming, which is the big issue that IFAD talks about and raises as an important issue that's impacted by climate change, and an important issue for our world. Nothing on the front page news about that. When we moved into 2016, there was a drop-off in reporting of migration, which is somewhat understandable considering the peak we had in September of 2015. There was a little more reporting about agriculture, but this was due to a crisis in France. It was all domestic agricultural reporting in France. And then again, very little in the UK and French media about climate change. And as you can see, compare the middle red column to the red column on the left, a drop-off actually in the British and French media on reporting on climate change 2 months after COP21 as opposed to the 2 months before COP21. The US and Italian media was slightly better on the climate change issues, still a heavy bias towards migration. And in terms of the migration stories, we looked at why people were migrating. Did the media talk about why people were migrating? They did, but it was only about conflict. So they were all fleeing either conflict in Syria or conflict in general. No other reasons, no other depth was given as to why somebody might be fleeing. Why did the conflict occur? What are they fleeing from? What is the background to help us in this room, I guess predominantly Europeans, to help us as Europeans understand why this huge group of migrants is moving from one continent into Europe. We also looked at the power voices. Now, luckily, when it came to migration, and this is all in the report, luckily when it came to migration, we did actually have a lot of migrant voices. Not enough, in my opinion, but we did actually hear quite a lot from migrants. People were interviewed at the Hungarian border, at the Croatian border, as to what they were experiencing. Obviously, these were in crisis moments for them, so it wasn't particularly in-depth comments on migration. They were explaining their experiences at the border, not necessarily why they were migrating, but we did actually hear from the migrants as to why they were migrating. When it came to climate change, stories tended to be international, and they tended to be very big, very hard to understand. It's just climate change is this big issue that really I, as an individual, wouldn't really know how to approach. It was a big crisis. It impacts us all. The politicians have been talking about it, but helping me understand as an individual, what I could do is quite difficult. And then if we move on to what our focus groups would tell us, so I've kind of skipped ahead of my slides, I do apologize. So as I said at the start, we were looking at the headlines, and this came through in our focus groups. And this is kind of a general theme across all 8 focus groups that, the broadsheets, so broadsheets in English means the reputable press, let's say, in the UK that would be The Guardian, in Italy, Corriere della Sera, not the tabloids, so the more sensationalist press. The broadsheets, you can get the articles there on climate change that go in depth, providing you can find them. They certainly won't be front page. And as we saw in the coding, this was very, very much the case. There was very little on the front page about climate change. And that was also felt by the audience. The audience were like, well, you can if you look very hard for it, but we don't really know where to look for it, especially if we're not particularly interested in climate change. And then how did the news organizations report on it? Well, the audiences felt it's often exaggerated, and reports on climate change panic people and don't help us find solutions. So reporting on climate change is frequently exaggerated, it panics people, instead of helping find solutions, even small solutions which could change the daily behavior of each of us. Another person noted that it's preferable to start with small solutions than starting by criticizing huge catastrophes. We cannot do anything about huge catastrophes. And this idea of what can we do really came through from the audience and very, very much clashes with what we're seeing in the content analysis of what the media is actually putting out. So the desires of the audience is not actually being met by the media. Again, what I want is for the media to tell me what I can do about it. What can I do about it as an individual? Now, this person believed there was actually an understanding of climate change and migration and the fact that if crops are failing and people have malnutrition. But again, a real misunderstanding about what they could actually do about it. And then when we looked at the news game, what was very interesting is all 8 focus groups basically replicated what they saw in the news. They didn't think at all like, oh, we could do something different. This is how I would like news to be. What they did was like, oh, this is how news is. So they're saying that the issues we're tackling aren't being explained by the news, but the power of the structure of news as it is today in terms of just reporting on the sensationalist big issues around climate change, they don't really know what to do about it. And they just replicated the views of what the media should be, rather than say, actually, we'd like to see it a different way. So the role of the importance that, for me, tells us is that the media really has to think about how it's reporting on these things to actually help audiences. Because the audiences really do believe news should be this way. So unless it's the media itself that changes this, to give people a better understanding of what they can do about issues surrounding climate change, we're going to have a problem. And, we found it hard to approach the news game, so actually putting together a bulletin yourself. We found hard to approach it without thinking about what will sell, not what we want to put in it. I was thinking about what the media puts out, not what I thought was important to have in the news bulletin. So the audience just expects this replication to happen, and they replicated it themselves. And there was also a call from the audiences to put climate change higher up and to be more honest about what they think was going on. There was a belief that a lot is not being talked about, certainly on the front pages of newspapers, in the main bulletins of television channels. So they think an awful lot is not being talked about, and I'm sure we'll have differences of opinion on that, because I'm sure there is a lot that's being talked about. But this was really the view of the audience that was coming through in the focus groups. So that was a brief summary of the research we did. I hope that's going to lead us into some discussion and provide you some questions. So yeah, it's all in there in the report that I think you can pick up here, right? James is nodding at the back. There is a copy of the report which explains more of the methodology of the news game, how that works, and actually more in depth of the findings. But I'd hope we'd have a discussion about it now.
Thank you, Sam. You didn't mention the polar bear thing. Do you want to
I didn't mention the polar bear thing,
because
yes.
that really hit
Sorry,
me.
you said that before. So, polar bears, right? People really are kind of fed up of seeing polar bears when they're seeing reporting about climate change. Somebody referred it to the hackneyed view of climate change. So the view that we just replicate the polar bear issue again and again and again. And actually for the audience, that's becoming quite a tedious image to see. Same with the smokestacks, right? You either use polar bears or you use factories with smoke coming out of them. Those images about climate change are actually not very useful at all for the audience to actually understand what's going on. Polar bears are a long way away from Perugia. Understanding the environment and how polar bears' environment is being destroyed is actually a long, long way away from the news audiences in Europe and the United States for them to actually understand climate change and what they can do to change it.
Yeah, it hit me because I read in the report that some man said, I want to know about the food coming to my table, not about the polar bear. Personally, I like polar bears. But just to clarify who I am, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Patricia Thomas, and I work with Associated Press Television. And I think I probably was invited also to do a big mea culpa, because AP, for one, does do this major slalom between the earthquake, the tsunami, the major migration story with 300 migrants sinking and dying in a ship, and not going back to the source, to the root causes, to the solution. So yes, we are also definitely guilty of that. And so now I want to pass the floor to Laurie, who works specifically on improving journalism and getting journalists out there doing more solution stories. Can you tell us about what you do and what you think of this report?
Sure. I work for the Thomson Reuters Foundation. We're the sort of charitable arm of Reuters. Sorry. And so we cover undercovered stories, things that we think aren't covered well enough in the media, and we put those stories out on the Reuters wire. So we essentially supplement what does go to lots and lots of media around the world. And we're doing that not only through having our own reporters, but I have a string of it's more than 100 freelance writers now who are in some of the most climate vulnerable countries around the world. And I think that they see the stories that I'm never going to see from London. They come up with the ideas, and what we do is help people then who are learning about this topic or who are trying to write about it, and sometimes in quite detail in a language that's not their own. And we essentially work with them and bring that stuff up to the level that it can go out on the Reuters wire. So it's a way both to get the news from the ground out, and it's a way to train people who are out there in the field how to do this writing, know how to do it so they can do it for all their own media as well. I'm curious with those of you who, I presume most of you are journalists, how many of you think that climate change contributes to migration? Can I see a show of hands? Okay. How many of you can prove that? Great. See, this I think gets to one of the issues that is a problem. We find when we're writing about this that climate change is something that accelerates things that are already happening. It's one of many drivers of migration. And I think this is one of the things that makes it hard for journalists to cover this link very well, because you are talking about multiple drivers of migration: conflict is the driver. Behind the conflict, there may be climate change. There may be poor governance. There may be any number of other, environmental degradation generally that's separate from climate change. And teasing out, saying that an event is attributable to climate change is very, very difficult. And I think that's one of the things that really makes doing this and drawing this link tough. I think that another one, I'm a former American newspaper correspondent. You guys know how many American newspaper correspondents are left out in the field these days. Most of us have lost our jobs over the last 10 or 15 years because of the contraction in American media. And that is really, really difficult, because the way that you can tell these stories really well is to be in an area looking at the migration patterns, following families, watching what happens with their crops, watching if someone leaves to migrate, and really tracking this. And that's very, very difficult to do now when there are not as many people out in the field. I think you can still put a face on this. Those of you in Europe, it's a fantastic opportunity. There are migrants all around us. You can put a face on this story, and you can talk to them about what brought them here. Though I think always there's continue to be issues about whether people are telling the real story. When there are fake passports out there and people having to claim that they're from somewhere they're not, it's very complicated. I'll leave it there.
Okay, I want to pass the microphone now to Jacopo. Jacopo, like I said earlier, has worked all over the world. At lunch, he was telling me a little bit about some work in Sudan, teaching the community, working on a community reforestation project. Definitely didn't see any of that in the mainstream media. How can the media do more on the things that you see all the time?
Thank you, Patricia. Well, I think, here the important point is to recognize that, as Laurie was saying, that migration is driven as well by climate change and environmental mismanagement. Because one point I think it is important to make is that environment and climate change is the same thing. Actually, climate change is a resultant force of mismanagement of natural resources. And then the solution is one of the solutions, of course, is to work on this management, to fix what has been broken. Now, of course, we cannot fix the changes in the climate. This is a fact. It's a fait accompli. That's why now most of the organizations, mine as well, are investing massively in adaptation. So what we said. What we see from the field, Sudan is just one of the cases, is that especially small farmers, people that have less than 5 hectares, but the majority has even less than 1 hectare, depends heavily on climate to have their livelihood. So when you think about climate change, again, it's not only the polar bear, which is, of course, one of the victims, as everybody else. But it's the fact that if these people receive less water or less snow or increased temperatures, then the formula is very easy. It means zero food. Now, the majority of these migrants have agriculture as their subsistence activity. So no agriculture, so no water, no snow, no increased temperature means no food. And no food means you have to live because you want to save the family. It's a natural instinct of conservation. So you move. And the majority of the migrants are rural migrants. So we're talking about people that is forced out because of changed patterns in climate from their lands to the first urban area, and then to hop up the chain till they reach some, other places where they can express their human potential. So what IFAD does is investing massively on these people, making sure that, and that's probably our contribution as well to addressing the problem, is to make sure that these people can still make a living, and not just survival, but a living out of their lands, even if they are small lands, by introducing new ways of doing agriculture, by applying the right methodology to the uses of land, of natural resources, and mostly to understand the linkages between natural resources and life. We moved to a complete natural-based society, to a society that thinks that is not part of the environment. So we created this kind of autistic box that is called environment that we don't really, we don't really place in our daily life. And we think exactly, the polar bear. So it's somewhere distant, it's far, it's on the pack, is not, affecting me. But actually, whatever we do is the resultant of the way we use resources. So if our way of using resources is damaging, well, we are just destroying ourselves. Now, communities that are more advanced and have better governance or more preparedness can cope better, but not indefinitely with the problem. So the people that cannot cope because of a number of reasons, lack of opportunities, lack of governance, poverty, first, they're forced to move. So actually, climate is one of the drivers of migrations, and stories are there. But I would like to stress an important point that was highlighted in the document and that we discussed as well during lunch, is that it's not all dark. Let's stop thinking, oh, there is climate change, it's like, an alien monster that comes to eat us. First, we are responsible of climate change, therefore the responsibility of fixing the issue. And when I say we, it's humans, it's not just this community, more than that. I mean, it's a global it's a global problem that affects everybody. But if things are done in a proper way, if resources are managed with, a long-term perspective, with rational on it, with an optimization approach, well then there is a massive contribution into fixing not only the climate issue, which means that we are going to adapt to this new developing situation, but as well to support those people, those communities that cannot do it right away. So I think, we have to focus in terms of, telling stories about all the good cases. And these are there. And as Laurie was saying, and Sam and you were saying, you have to talk to people. We cannot just wait for the disaster and then, of course, the person will talk negatively.
A question for all three of you. Over lunch, I think it was Sam who said, if it bleeds, it leads, which is a phrase that many of us journalists know. That's what makes headlines. That's what our editors want. How do you prove to them, and what is the solution to the problem in journalism to show positive stories, solution stories? Do any of you have a good answer to that?
I think there's been a couple of panels here around solutions journalism or constructive journalism, whatever you want to call it. People want it, and it was coming through in the focus groups. People want solutions. People want in-depth views. I'm thinking about, February, it says in the report, February was the hottest month on record, and we just saw the headlines about that, and that's, for me, that's quite a terrifying idea. It's like, what does that mean? But I think there's a lot of organizations which are going away from just this kind of, February's the hottest month on record, what we're going to do with it, I don't know, but it's very terrifying, to actually thinking about what does that mean and what's the solution. And the reality is, if you look at the metrics of some organizations that are doing this, it's actually having an impact, right? So I can't remember which website it was, but they have people spend longer on the page when the story is about a solution to a problem rather than just, it bleeds, it leads. They actually spend more time on the page, which means increased revenue for a news organization. It means increased advertising revenue for a news organization. Danish televisions, Danish public broadcaster DR, now has a quota of constructive stories. So not happy, I'm not talking about happy news. I'm talking about approaching a problem and talking about solutions, so constructive solutions to a problem. Their viewership in Denmark increased when they started doing this, when they introduced this quota. So it proves that actually there's good business model in doing this, in actually providing solutions to problems. And in the focus groups and the research, that's what people really, really wanted. So, I think the evidence is there that news organizations should be moving in this way. And I think when it comes to climate change and migration, it's two areas that are completely ripe in which to tackle these problems.
Laurie, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think a few different things. We find that stories about solutions are hugely well read. I would say we get about 3 times as many hits on those as we do on misery stories. And one of the things I ask all these freelancers I work with now to do is to always ask, if they go out to report on some kind of a crisis, to ask why, what needs to be done, is it happening, and if not, why not? And often just being by rote asking these questions as part of their reporting, they come up with very, very interesting things. We've done quite a number of stories now about, not about what's happening, but about why something isn't happening. And the answers are very enlightening and very interesting. So I think that you really can find quite good stories that are not, happy news stories just to try to be that. I think giving people giving everyone a sense that this is all doom and gloom and there's nothing to be done about any of it is just, people are turning it off. I find that I turn off in reading news when it's all just seems completely grim. I don't know about you. I mean, we're journalists, but I find on a drumbeat of really, really negative stories on almost any topic, I'm unlikely to read them every single day. So I think it's worth looking around and looking outside the regular tendency to just cover the event at the moment, to look for these things, because they're really interesting, and that's where the good stories are.
Jacopo, do you find that journalists are coming to you, or people where you're working, in countries where you're working, there are journalists who are reaching out to these poor farmers or trying to find these solution stories, or not at all?
Well, not at all. But what we are doing, we are supporting local press to stimulate. I mean, we are trying to stimulate this process in many different projects. Not only because it's good to expose good things on paper. It's not just about tragedy. Otherwise, you need really like Prozac after the morning reading. But as well because if you start reporting of positive things, of positive solution applied to common problems, well, that means that the reader himself can learn out of this. So it becomes really a knowledge sharing. It's not just, I think we have as well to move from, okay, I report about something that happened, then rather to I share something that is useful. And I think this is, for us, it's a major topic, and it's extremely important because it will help really to transmit the message and to share with all the others that are not maybe part of your project or your intervention to be exposed to a possible solution rather than a disaster.
Okay. I'd like to open it up now to some of your questions. I'm hoping we'll get lots both in English and Italian. Many of you are journalists. Have you covered climate change stories? Have you covered migration stories? I imagine most of you have done that. And what your experience has been and what you think about this whole question. Do we have anyone out there with a question? Think where?
Patricia, there is this.
Sorry, where?
This.
Okay, microphone's coming.
Okay, I think my question is mainly for Jacopo. I'm a journalist dealing with African issues, and in the past years, the phenomenon of the so-called land grabbing has been widely covered, as long as the word widely applies to African subjects. And I was wondering whether there are data that prove that there's a link between people being relocated in other parts of the country because of land grabbing and the decision of these people to leave the country.
You want to take a round of questions and then we answer? How do you
No, let's do one at a time for now.
Well, I don't think I'm the right person to answer your question. I'm not, dealing with land grabbing issues. I mean, it's definitely a major issue, but I'm really not the right person to answer you. Sorry.
There is someone who has any clues about? Sorry.
Sorry. Anyone else? Climate change. We have a woman up here for the microphone. Over here? No, here in the second. Yes, you can ask it in Italian. Did you get the microphone though? Scusi, c'è una signora qua.
Volevo chiedere appunto una strategia per poter parlare di cambiamenti climatici potrebbe essere non solo appunto quello delle buone notizie, ma quello delle notizie più piccole, quelle diciamo locali, per esempio, no? L'inondazione di un'area definita che deve essere raccontata appunto raccontando anche le cause e spiegando alla popolazione che possono fare qualche cosa, cioè possono, una volta che lo hanno capito, sollecitare per esempio le pubbliche amministrazioni nell'azione specifica di adattamento, in questo caso piuttosto che di mitigazione, ma comunque di adattamento al fenomeno specifico. Quindi la domanda in sostanza è questa: è un buon giornalismo quello di sollecitare la popolazione, la cittadinanza ad azioni di pressione, ecco, per le pubbliche amministrazioni, per i decisori? E come eventualmente suggerite i giornalisti in particolare che si agisca, insomma, che si possa fare una buona informazione in questo modo, ecco, se lo ritenete opportuno.
I think I'll let them comment on this. I think in general, I grew up in Boston, Cambridge area, and there was a bumper sticker that said, think globally, act locally. And I think that can be also true for journalists. It's good to think about climate change on a large scale, but sometimes as a journalist you should focus in on those issues in your area, put pressure on the local government through your journalism for certain things. So that's my opinion. Then there's the other issue that Laurie mentioned before about how there's so many less, at least for the US media, so many less foreign correspondents, so many less people covering Africa, Asia, in small towns and places. So there are less people talking about some of these very important climate change issues in those places. Anyway, I'll pass that to you guys to address.
Yeah, I think that that you can. There's ways to give people ways to act that are not sort of advocacy and saying this is what you've got to go out and do. I mean, I think in the U.S., as in many places, there's this perception that what we spend on aid is a huge portion of the budget. You know, it's 15-20% of our budget every year. The fact is that it's a tiny, it's, a fraction of 1%. And I think that if you can tell these stories alongside things like, I was just talking to someone in agricultural development the other day who said that there's very bad drought in Zimbabwe, and there's a lot of people that are going to be hungry in that country and in other places around there this year. He said that for $50 million, they could scale up some kind of smart changes to agriculture that would essentially protect many farmers against drought. The UNDP has already set aside $60 million for food aid in Zimbabwe for this year, and the government of Zimbabwe, admittedly, is always looking for probably a bit more even than it needs, but it's asking for $1.6 billion. Now, that's a good story, because that's a story about your tax dollars that could really be saved, and spent in a way that's a lot smarter, that helps a lot of people, that could end up cutting migration, cutting other things besides migration that are impacts of climate change. I mean, from child marriage, trafficking of people, there's all sorts of things that are linked to things going really, really bad at home. So I would argue that that's one way to go about it.
Sam, do you have something to say about?
Yeah, I mean, to go to the local issue, I think, in the research we did, there was a big demand from people to actually have local issues better explained to them. I think the problem is we tend to see climate change and the impacts of climate change and migration in and of itself even as these kind of enormous problems, insurmountable problems. And climate change tended to be reported as, either a global issue or something that was a long, long way away from us. And I think if local news organizations actually tried to, it would be good to do some research on how local news reports on this, but purely from my own observations as, reading local news where I live and where my family lives, you see very little about climate change at all. You maybe see some like recycling programs or things like that. But I think if local news actually engaged with it, you'd actually, as a smaller micro problem rather than this macro problem, you'd actually get a lot further. And those problems, those solutions we'd be talking about, actually, we'd actually see some real life ones, realistic ones.
Jacopo?
Well, no, I think with the experts.
Do you have a question over there?
Yeah.
Okay.
La farò in italiano. Io sono una giornalista freelance, mi occupo soprattutto di fenomeni legati alle migrazioni e ai richiedenti asilo. Mi occupo di tematiche legate appunto al climate change più per interesse personale come lettrice che non come autore. La cosa che mi suscitavano le vostre riflessioni, mi veniva da porre quella domanda, di guardare la questione dall'altro punto di vista, cioè noi giornalisti quando abbiamo raccontato le migrazioni, soprattutto nell'ultimo anno, è emersa in maniera molto forte la distinzione fra il profugo, il richiedente asilo e il migrante economico, senza domandarci troppo quali sono le cause che portano il migrante economico a fuggire. E quindi la domanda che mi faccio e che vi faccio è: che colpa hanno anche i media nell'accentuare queste differenze, ponendo il migrante economico come una sorta di serie B, cioè tu scappi, vieni qua perché vuoi stare meglio, quindi tutto sommato potevi startene dove stavi e vivere, continuare tranquillamente la tua vita senza mischiarti con chi ha veramente bisogno di aiuto.
Sì, io secondo questa domanda nel senso, I'm sorry, I would agree with this question in that I spent a lot of time myself personally for AP television in the ports of Catania, Lampedusa, interviewing so many migrants that were coming last spring, and it'll happen again this summer, mostly from Africa, Gambia, Senegal, many of them economic migrants. And there was an interest in this story, especially when they were dying in the water. And then suddenly it just sort of all switched over to the Syrian ones, and people only cared about them because they were escaping war, and nobody was really interested in the story of these African migrants. And it continues to be that way. So it's disturbing. It's a concern. But I'll pass it also to you guys.
My thinking is, I refer to something Laurie said at the start of, how do we prove that climate change has affected migration? And I was thinking about that. And it's speed, I think. Climate change is a slow phenomenon, right? It happens over time. Whereas, I worked in television news for 13 years. Television news is immediate. So we have to know what the solution is, what's happening now. Why is it, now. Rather than actually looking backwards and thinking, well, this led to this, this led to this. So I think, if we can find a way to somehow take a deeper breath, think of the slow food and the fast food movement, maybe we need a slow news and a fast news movement as well, and have a bit more slow news to actually, everything's happening so fast, right? I switch on Twitter every day and it's like, this avalanche of news, avalanche of stories, avalanche of reasons and explanations. And I wonder if in this world of social media a little bit, it's not our job as journalists to actually take a bit of a slow news approach and take our time to actually explain why things have happened in a kind of process way. So, in the research report, I reference academic pieces which are kind of showing that in Syria particularly, there was a drought which led to migration to the cities, which then led to the conflict, right? But not many people talk about that. Not many people understand that. And it actually took, rather than a journalistic research, academic research to actually come to those conclusions. So personally, I think it's interesting. I don't know if many of you saw the Times of London, the real Times, has decided to refocus away from breaking news to more in-depth articles. And I think that's a good way to go for many news organizations in this world of fast news all the time through social media, through Twitter, through Facebook, and so on and so forth.
Jacopo, in your work, do you see that, you're seeing climate change out there affecting migration in over a longer period of time? Are people not willing to listen to what you're doing? Is it too slow?
Well, it's a bit more complicated because I think, from of course, if you say that somebody runs away from a war, it's easier to be accepted probably by the large population. Now, if you allow me, I would like to revert the question. So how many of these wars that are causing so much refugees or migrants or whatever are caused by climate change or are driven, among the other, of course, elements? And this, I think, it cannot, the answer, and this is my personal opinion, of course, cannot come from us. The answer should come from the press. I think it's your responsibility as somebody that need to talk to the others and for the others most of the time. And in your case, from what I understood, for those that have nobody that speaks for them, to show these links. But this needs exactly, first, to look into the issue. Definitely, when you look at the Syrian war, there was, before the war, a massive internal migration linked to the drought. And this drought is most probably, if not triggered, but surely enhanced by climatic changes. Now, the difference between the two subjects that you identified is just that one lives most probably into a burst conflict and one in the conflict to be. And that's wherever you see conflicts nowadays, actually conflict is and has always been related to natural resources and who should access and uses them. Now, we never faced conflict, at least on a large scale, on natural resources that were freely available and widely distributed, which is not anymore the case. So now you fight because your field doesn't have rain anymore, so you need water. So I think, it's more, I think we could spend 3 entire years just answering this question. But I think, really, I would like to see from the press an in-depth analysis of the causes. And believe me, the materials, the documents are extremely and widely available online. And we are most welcome to look at our website as well.
Go ahead, sorry.
I think too that in the reporting that you do, when you're out talking to migrants, some of that is just talking to someone as they're toting their child along and passing by, and you don't have time to go into much detail on that. But I think when you have the opportunity to sit down with someone who you have got a common language with and you have the chance, just be a 2-year-old, just ask why. Why? What came before that? So you decided to leave. Why was that? Well, this happened. Well, why did that happen? And you keep getting an answer and just keep peeling down. And I bet that you'll find at some point in the background of that, you'll get to some of these reasons, that there was crop failure, that the governance was really bad, that you can begin to track it back, I think. And through telling someone's story that way, that's your avenue to make this case, I think, that climate change is a contributor to this. I was at the Paris climate meeting at the end of last year, and there was a big session on migration and climate change there. And every major migrant organization was represented at that thing, and they all said uniformly that what we're seeing now in migration in Europe is nothing compared to what we are going to see as a result of land degradation and climate change coming up. And so trying to sort out these issues now is an incredibly useful thing for journalists to do, because if you can get to these answers, they're going to be really, really important in the future. And even some of the things that you might not think about, they argue that migration is always seen as a failure of adaptation. Well, migration also might need to be a form of adaptation. If you're dealing with, say, sea level rise, at a certain point you're not going to adapt anymore in land that's underwater. And so I think that it's really journalists' job to dig into some of these issues and try to look for some answers and push people for them before we see even more of what we're seeing now.
Before I came here, I stopped by briefly at a thing with Jay Carney and Mario Calabresi talking about explanatory journalism. And Jay Carney was saying, we talk a lot about Twitter and things getting shorter and shorter, but there's also much more room now with blogs, with the internet, for much longer explanatory journalism, and some of this could easily fit in that format. Other questions? Okay, I've got one at the back there is the microphone, and then another at the front here. Who's got the microphone? Okay, one right down here first, and then we'll have one at the back. Wait, hang on, we're going to do this one first, sorry.
Sì, mi domandavo, abbiamo cercato, cioè si è proposto appunto di trovare soluzioni per una miglior comunicazione e anche come ottimizzare gli strumenti a nostra disposizione. Adesso con i migliori auguri molto probabilmente le generazioni presenti in questa sala non vivranno direttamente gli effetti dei cambiamenti climatici, quindi mi domandavo magari se era possibile e in che modo coinvolgere le generazioni, la generazione che sarà più direttamente coinvolta, quindi le più giovani.
Absolutely. I think the younger generation cares a lot about. I have my own 15-year-old daughter. Every time I'm brushing my teeth, she comes and turns off the water. It says, "Don't waste water, Mom." So I think yes, I'm all in favor of including the younger generations. But again, I'll pass it to the speakers here.
Yeah, I think they have a huge stake in this, and they're interested in it, and we'll tell these stories. But I completely disagree with you that we're not going to see the impacts. The impacts are there. This is not a problem of the future. This is a problem right now in huge places in the world. I mean, lots and lots of the world is being affected now. If you get a chance, go out and look. Even in, within Europe there are things happening, but almost anywhere you go in Africa these days, particularly the Sahel in South Asia, it's happening now.
Sam?
In terms of tools, I think, to speak on that, I think there's a huge opportunity for news organizations to experiment with new tools in telling these stories. I'm the age I am, and I saw Snapchat. I've used Snapchat for the first time here. I mean, I use a lot of social media, but I've never really got into Snapchat. But then seeing that and seeing how Snapchat works, I'd love to see, stories aimed at people of the Snapchat age, Snapchat generation, looking at these issues. And I think there'd be so much to be done. For instance, just thinking off the top of my head, every migrant rightly has a smartphone coming across Europe. It's their life source. Now, a smart news organization, number one, is using WhatsApp to interview these people. Because somebody who's migrating, you don't know where they're going to be from when they leave, let's take from Turkey, if they leave Izmir, Çeşme, move over to the islands, move to Athens, move onwards and onwards and onwards. If you're a smart journalist, I think there's a huge opportunity to reach out to these people, to connect with these people, and you can keep interviewing them using things like WhatsApp. Now, taking that further, I'd love to see Snapchat channels with these people and to understand why, the 2-year-old question. Why? And they give you the time. You're never going to be able to sit down with somebody who's migrating away from Syria because of climate change and understand that if you just meet them in Lesbos, for instance. It's going to be very hard. You can meet them in Lesbos, form a bond with them, and then use these tools, these new tools that are aimed at the generation you're talking about, to keep the conversation flowing and to tell stories of their migration, and then also the backstory of why and where they came from. I mean, I'd love to see news organizations really engage with those kind of ideas.
It'd be great.
Yeah.
Jacopo, you have a 2-year-old. I imagine you want to say something.
Oh my goodness. It's already difficult like this. No, I think definitely youth are the target, should be the target. There is no discussion about it. Also because they're more reactive, and in my opinion, they have a better understanding. They're more pragmatic than my generation. So yes, it has to be done, and I agree with the colleagues. I mean, like, climate change is not that it's happening, it's happened. So the climate has changed and will keep changing. And I can tell you that wherever you go, even here in Umbria, the impacts are massive. Just consider that Piemonte lost 43% of his income related to skiing. And this is not just 1 year, it's a trend. And we have data for every place on Earth, and the trend is a changing patterns. So, but one last thing on youth. Where the press has to be more attentive is that you should not terrorize the youth. I mean, I think the situation is already depressing, but we have to push youth into positive thoughts, and not just, okay, what can you do? Not, oh my goodness, you cannot ski anymore. Oh my goodness, you cannot do this. Oh my God, you can. So, and consider that worldwide 1 out of 7 youth is ready and willing to migrate, and North Africa and Middle East and Near Asia, we have 1 to 3. 1 in 3 it's about to migrate. So, and most of these countries, some of these youth have opportunities in their homeland, but the mindset is negative. So they think that opportunities are always next door. So let's start also building a different appetite for the youth, new opportunities, new things.
Okay, back there was a question.
If climate stories with solutions get 3 times as many reads, why are journalists and editors not doing more of these stories? Is it just that they don't accept or know about this business model, the case for it? And what can we do to actively change the situation? I'm an environment press officer at the University of Leeds, and we have a wealth of research in adaptation that nothing would please me more than to get that into the front page of every newspaper. How can we do this? What can we do?
You need a polar bear, I think, is what you need.
No polar bear.
Just kidding.
I mean, sorry, maybe I was unclear. I didn't say that stories which report solutions on climate change get 1/3 more views. It was just solutions-based stories get 1/3, be it whatever the solution be. So, sorry if I was unclear on that. I mean, I think getting, if I were, working in a university, or indeed somebody like IFAD, similar kind of trajectories in sort of the research that your academics are doing, I'd just love to see that data being made available to journalists, which is positive, which is, provides a solution to a problem, not just saying, this is the hottest month ever, oh my God, rather, so, and what do we do? And how do your academics or the people at your university, how would they propose a solution to that? And I think that's where we're going. I think in terms of solution-based journalism in general, it's kind of a trend in the last year, 2 years, 2.5 years really. I think it's gathering pace. Organizations like BuzzFeed are making a massive difference in this space. And when at conferences like this, when people talk about those returns and the increased engagement time, people are going, wow, and it is starting to spread. The first time I heard about it was at a conference in Morocco 3 years ago, and now I'm hearing about it at every conference I go to. So I think that it is a positive thing, and it is spreading because of the numbers we're talking about.
I will just, go ahead, sorry, Laurie, go ahead.
I think you have to find ways to make it interesting, because there's a lot of really good, worthy solutions out there. We have admittedly, we do this, a lot more of this than many mainstream media do, but I heave a sigh every time I see another thing about clean cook stoves and how people are not breathing fumes and no children are burning their homework with the thing. I've just seen this 10 billion times, and I tell people, I don't want to know about that. I want to know about power for running industry now. That's what, I want bigger scale. I don't want to hear about 10 farmers that are digging pits to plant their maize in, and that has made things better. I want to hear about 10,000 of them and how the ministry has taken this on and is putting its budget toward it. And I want to see people in it. I think one of the good things you can do, if you're trying to get across these, is to tell journalists, we've got this thing going on. Here are 4 people in Ethiopia. I can get on the phone with you. Or why don't you go out there? We can, help you arrange a visit to go and see this for yourself. I mean, I think that's how, if you can get media to invest in getting someone out there, they're going to put that, they're much more likely to put that on the front page. So just find ways to put people with the innovation and realize that it has to be big now. Little tiny climate innovations, I think, are not enough anymore.
On the people front, that came out in our focus groups. So what we did was, in the news game part, they had a selection of people they could interview, and we had an academic expert from the University of Oxford, people on the ground, and invariably, even though in general they repeated the structure of news bulletins, the focus groups preferred to hear from people on the ground. They tended to eschew the experts because they expected the journalist to have done the interview and to report what the experts are saying, but they wanted to hear about how it impacted people locally on the ground or wherever on the ground.
Just to add, I'm here sort of as the devil's advocate, or just to be the mea culpa one. From AP's perspective, it is hard to see our editors pushing in a solutions. I mean, we're all over Brussels terrorism. That will get us a lot of attention. And the Amanda Knox murder, Meredith Kircher, I've spent a lot of time here in Perugia. That wasn't a solution story. So it's hard to convince editors. It's hard to make that move, but it's a good thing to start doing. You wanted to comment on?
No, just a very brief comment. It's true that there is tons of material out there, but maybe us as well, we have to do the effort to translate better these materials. You know, sometimes, you know, we indulge with our own jargon, and we talk as everybody already is fully aware and knows. So, you know, like when we write, we also have to think that 99% of the others do not really are expert in the field. So, and for a journalist to receive 300 pages paper that says how to adapt to climate change, it's unreadable most of the time. So a little more effort from our side probably is as well needed. Well,
who else?
good.
I think. Do you have a question back there? No, you have the microphone guy.
I think I saw there is a question.
Down here.
She's
Okay,
waiting,
sorry.
she's waiting.
Down here.
Yeah, a question to Jacopo, because I was looking at your webpage right now, and
webpage?
I was seeing that some activity, for instance, in Colombia, where a country I well know, that you do some projects there. So I was wondering what kind of problems have the IFAD encountered in areas that are very difficult, politically and, I mean, security because of paramilitary and guerrilla and... So that's a question, because, I mean, how to deal with the population and also the money that you receive, but because I see here, like, for instance, a project that costs $69 million, and I know, well, that's, I mean, the state, for instance, wouldn't imply so much money for some development in the regions. And a question to Laurie, if you were saying you train people in some countries that do development, what kind of also support or training do you also give to journalists that have to work in areas that are as difficult as, for instance, in Colombia, where there is also, difficult climate?
Sure. Well, I can't really talk about Colombia because it's not one of the countries I'm responsible for, so I don't know the case of Colombia. But in general, you know, I mean, wherever we can work, we work. And the mandate of IFAD is to target smallholders, rural poor. And there is there is a lot of attention and money invested in making sure that this is done through the whole process. Then second thing, consider that we do not just give money. You know, most of the cases are loans taken by the state, so there is a huge responsibility for the states, and every cent that is provided is audited, so there is a huge investment in securing that the money reaches the target population. Then, of course, it has to be seen case by case, so I cannot really answer about a case where I don't have experience on cases where, like the one you present. Say it again? Yeah. Well, look, first, when you work on themes that are transversal, you have less problems. You know, we are not involved into a theme that will privilege, for example, one community or another one. And usually the approach is to make sure that conflict is solved and not, fueled. And if we see that the risk is too high, there is a risk assessment. If the risk is too high, we intervene somewhere else. Of course, with the government and with the counterparts.
Laurie, I think there was a second part for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to work in lots of places. I had a reporter last week that was in central Burkina Faso where it was 49 degrees C. And they blew up a hotel in Ouagadougou not that long ago. This is the 4th time that we tried to do this trip. And all the previous ones were put off because of security concerns or other problems. Or, just plain it's now the rainy season and you can't get through on the roads. So, yeah, it's challenging to get out in these places and cover these things. I was in Colombia the day that, I've forgotten her name now, that was kidnapped, the politician there that was held for all those years. Yeah, she drove into the Despeje there, and I flew in a helicopter, and she was kidnapped that same day. I'm really aware of what people are up against. I mean, in the training that we do, in our coverage, we try to use a lot of local journalists because they already know the situation on the ground. They're very familiar with what's there, and we help them out. We, for instance, have little pictures of our journalists on our website. We've taken those off for some reporters who are in risky areas and that kind of thing. But, I mean, in the training that we do, we train journalists and editors because I think it's really important that it's really frustrating when you train journalists to do good coverage of climate change and they go back into the newsroom and the editor says, we're really much more interested in something else. Why would we want to do this? So we train editors as well now. We find that works better. And we try to do mentoring because I think one-time training gets people excited, but it's very hard to change culture of what you're doing. But if you have ongoing access to someone who can help you, either by putting a mentor in the newsroom, which is what we're doing increasingly, or just having an ongoing relationship with people that you've trained, which is what I do largely, that it can be really useful. And people see the stories. It's fantastic. They start out thinking that this is boring stuff and they're not really interested, and they get out in the field and they start asking questions and they fall in love with these stories.
Okay, we've got one right here.
I would like to ask you, which are, in your opinion, the more important data that prove that migration is also caused by climate change? I mean, which are the data that you would like to see published in the front page by media? Thank you.
I think Jacopo is the best one to answer that.
Sure. Well, the data available is that the majority of the migrants are rural migrants. So we are talking about people that by 99% have their livelihood from agriculture. And then usually you have waves of migration, and these waves are linked usually to droughts or floods or, let's say, events that are clearly identifiable. Now, what I would like to see in the press is the link between these two. Because highlighting the link will first allow policymakers to intervene faster and not just with the usual times. So this is for, to address the issue when people leave, but at the same time it will help countries that receives these people to understand what's going on, and not just, receiving mass of people. So these linkages are extremely important. And data are widely, again, available online. I mean, there are plenty of scientific documents, not just my opinion. It's there is plenty of scientific evidence of effects on agriculture and therefore on rural people.
Did you want to comment? Okay. Is, any other questions? Back there. Oh, sorry. All right, straight at the back, and then we'll go to you. Straight back there.
Ho una domanda riguardo all'interazione fra giornalismo scientifico e appunto le cronache delle migrazioni in atto. So che c'è un movimento che nega appunto il cambiamento climatico che è molto forte. Ad esempio, ho di recente letto paragoni fra la crisi agricola precedente alla rivoluzione francese del 1789 e le migrazioni in atto dall'Africa subsahariana. Come si fa È necessario descrivere un dibattito scientifico in atto o i documenti scientifici prodotti dall'ONU vanno assunti come dati di fatto, insomma?
Jacopo?
Well, I think this is a debate that is a bit more complicated and is not just related. I think the debate that you are referring to is whether climate change is human-induced or not. Right, but I think when you are a migrant and you are forced to leave your land because you have no water and no snow, you are not really interested in knowing if it's human or not human. Your need is to survive and to migrate. So I don't think, like the issue of who's responsible is extremely relevant in this specific context of migration.
Okay, I think this woman right back there want to make a comment.
No, this is Sam.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to add one.
Oh, Sam, sorry. One second.
No, I just wanted to add to that. I mean, honestly, at this stage, I think any movement that says it denies climate change is false, and it's the media's responsibility. I mean, about 5 years ago on the BBC, for instance, you'd have one climate change scientist and one climate change denier. And I think as a news organization now, we have to move away from that. Forget it. Climate change is a thing, it's happening, it's proven. And I think we're talking about comedy in news and how comedy actually somehow helps us understand the news better in the US. There's I'd recommend you to watch, a great John Oliver sketch where he, gets 99 climate change scientists and one climate change denier talking to him. And I think it's that kind of thing. So if we insist on this balancing out, I think we're going down the wrong path and we're doing a disservice to our audiences.
Okay, this woman here.
See, it was just a comment. So you said you would like to see those links highlighted on the media. Now here's a question about what I read. Is this true or not true? So I think that to talk about this issue, also journalists need to devote time to study the subject. So there's a problem of a lot of scientific writers, scientific journalists are being fired, also from The Guardian just a few days ago. And I wanted to go back to the polar bear story. That's a simple story. You have a polar bear, you have the sea ice shrinks, the polar bear falls down and dies. So why you see, I think, on the media the simple stories, it's because the other stories are more complex. You need time to read the big adaptation leaflets, books. So, and I was just also thinking, maybe it could help if you could help out putting a simple story out about agriculture, droughts, migration, to which journalists who are not specialists can refer to. And so what Paola was saying before also, maybe I was thinking, what about if media also put a series of stories? So maybe it's difficult in one piece to tell all the pieces, so maybe editors could think about, okay, I'll make a series. So I will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 papers on this subject. Because also you need to educate people in the meaning that if they don't have any pre-label knowledge, how can you go and talk about complex things in just 3,000 words? So maybe these subjects are better for a magazine than for a daily newspaper. So there's a lot of it's difficult also practically to talk about this, good.
I think you're raising a very, very important point. The polar bear story works. I work in TV. You see a polar bear dying and you want to cry. I mean, it's things that are simple. Good guys versus bad guys stories work. But life isn't that simple. So what do we need? We need money to be poured into this. That I think we'll let you guys comment on that. How we can maybe give scholarships to people to study, journalists to study science and things like that. But anyway, I'll let you guys respond. You're the panel.
I think that one of the things I'm getting very interested in is actually having journalists that don't know a lot about climate change but know a lot about their beat. trying to talk to them about where climate change is happening and what they already do, because your agricultural reporter is going to understand something about drought and the impact that's having on farmer incomes or export, import, or whatever. And I think health reporters in the US are starting to get it, that there's a lot of these disease patterns that are changing. Zika is lapping at our shores in the US, it's in Texas and places. This thing is not something that happens somewhere else. I think if you can look at, you don't have to talk so much about climate change, you can talk about the problems that are in people's lives. Food insecurity is one of them. We haven't had a big food shock really since 2008, but it's very, very possible that we're going to have this again quite soon, because there's a lot of vulnerability. I think look for those angles, and then learn a bit about climate change and move on from there. I think it's a good way to start. And I think it's great to do series and break it down. You write a 6,000-word piece that has everything to say about the links between migration and climate change. People put it on their pile of stuff they're going to read someday. You've got to have it in shorter pieces.
I've been told we need to wrap it up here. Any of you want to make one last comment? All right, well, thank you all for coming, and go out and write those climate change, migration stories, and get the ball rolling on this one. Thank you. Thank you.